I'm going to start this webinar with a land acknowledgement that will be largely specific to where I live and work, as well as where the University of Toronto situates. So today's Toronto, Ontario, Canada. But I encourage you all to reflect on the Indigenous lands you are joining us virtually from today. We would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. Toronto has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee peoples, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The treaties that were signed for this particular parcel of land are collectively referred to as the Williams Treaties of 1923. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. So again, welcome everyone to the Stories and Archives, so part 2 of a 3-part webinar series we're calling The Muslims in Canada Archives, the Power of Your Story Through Your Stuff. For those that missed last week's webinar, which was kind of the launch of the Muslims in Canada Archives, or MiCA for short, it was recorded and will be available on the Institute of Islamic Studies website. Very quickly though, MiCA is an initiative out of the Institute of Islamic Studies at U of T. I'll be going over briefly some important points that were made last week as well. Before we begin, I just want to go over the next webinar as well. So next webinar will be on January 12th, 2021, where I'll go into further detail about MiCA's processes and procedures, as well as how you can contribute to MiCA. But today's webinar is a continuation of that first one, in that we hope to share with you today the role of archives in piecing together the stories of Canadian Muslims. So we'll begin with an introduction by the director of the Institute of Islamic Studies at the University of Toronto, Dr. Anver Emon. From there, we'll look at how archives can help tell stories of Canadian Muslims through actual uncovered stories of a few pioneer Canadian Muslims. Next, I'll do a brief overview of what MiCA is, and finally, my co-panelist Hassam Munir and I will talk about the uses and futures of archives, answering questions such as who uses archives today and how can they serve Canadian Muslim communities. And finally, we'll open the floor to some questions from you. And Dr. Emon will be monitoring the Q&A. The Q&A won't be recorded, by the way, just so you all know. For now, I'll pass it off to Dr. Emon now to welcome you all.
Thank you very much, Moska, and assalamu alaikum to everyone. Welcome to our second webinar on MiCA, the Muslims in Canada Archives, a project at the Institute of Islamic Studies at the U of T. I am really excited for this series and delighted and grateful to Moska for organizing it, and of course to welcome our guest Hassam tonight, who will be introduced later. Last week's webinar, last week when we launched MiCA, it was, for me, was probably one of the more moving experiences at the Institute that we've had, even though in a context of virtual everything, being able to talk about the legacy of Dawood Hamdani with people who knew him well and knew him personally, worked closely with him, was a remarkable opportunity for us to think about a man who had devoted a large part of his life to thinking hard about how we make Muslims in Canada and their contributions to Canada, how we make all of that visible, legible, whether it's through large data or institutions like an archive. And having had two of our postdoctoral fellows, including Moska, fly out to visit him shortly before he died, having a consultation with him, getting his advice and seeking his guidance, it was appropriate for us to both hold that event, but also, to be frank, it very much carries forth the hopes that he shared with many of us and many of you on the call and that were here last week. And of course, we wanted to locate MiCA within the same trajectory of Dawood Hamdani's work. MiCA is a project that comes out of a large-scale consultative process. Many of you currently here actually have been part of that. I see Abdul Hai Patel, Imam Patel, salam alaikum. He's been a wonderful advisor to us as we've been talking about how to engage the larger Muslim communities and helping them to think historically, thinking about themselves as making history. Our dear colleague Fatima Sajan, who was here last week, has been actively involved with one of our partner organizations in the past, and CCM. So salam alaikum to you, Fatima. Jennifer Selby from Memorial University, one of our partner organizations, has already received a small grant to begin developing an archive that focuses on Muslims in Newfoundland and Labrador with the Muslims Association of Newfoundland and Labrador. And already we're beginning to see a lot of energy around this idea of recognizing there is a history to be told, and that history lies in primary source materials that you and others have in your basements, in places that you might think are really recycle worthy areas, are actually chock full of things that have historical significance. And so Jennifer's been phenomenal in helping us also think about how we expand the scope. Kathy Bullock, who really brought our attention to the Tesla Institute, is here, and we're really delighted to have her. And the Tesla Institute is a part of this project, really thinking about how to capture archivally, visually, digitally, different formats. And so, and I think my mom's even here from LA, so she's not connected to MiCA other than me. So, hey, Mom. But that's just a personal aside. To get back to work though, MiCA is an archive. And so part of what we want to do today is talk to you about what are archives for. We talk about the need to preserve, the need to ensure a legacy, the need to steward this legacy using the infrastructure of the university, not only as a major Canadian institution to Canadianize this very Muslim-inspired legacy, but also to preserve it for future generations, not just your children, but your children's children and strangers who will want to know about the kinds of things that you do and have done decades and generations from now. And so how do we preserve that material? How do we identify it, locate it, catalog it, and make it available to any who need to use it for research purposes, for artistic development, for creative arts, for storytelling? And in this context where Muslims are subject to national security narratives, being able to tell stories from archival collections as diverse as whatever you might be able to present offers an alternative to storytelling opportunity for us that we at the Institute want to make available. We don't want to tell the story. We want you to tell the story, but we want to provide the architecture where you can find the materials to use to tell your story. And that's ultimately what a core feature of MiCA is about. So that's what we're going to be doing today, is really thinking about what does it mean to be able to tell those stories. We're really delighted to have Hassam here in Moska. We'll do a proper introduction of him from my history, but he's already been thinking about how do we tell stories that aren't common, that aren't often featured in the mainstream media. What kinds of stories can we tell? What kinds of materials can we use to tell those stories? How far back can we go? The objective here is, of course, to show how vital an archive is and can be to history making, history creation, and alternative storytelling. How anyone, all of us on this call, can create histories if we just do some digging. Our job at MiCA is to make that digging easy for you. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Moska and Hassam. Moska, of course, is our postdoctoral fellow, our digital humanities fellow. Moska is a graduate of the Institute of the Information Management program here at the University of Toronto. We hired her a couple of years ago to really launch this idea of the archive, and she's made it her own, not only earning accolades from the Dean of the iSchool, the Chief Archivist here at U of T, but accolades from within the profession, identified as a leader within the field, as a young leader in the field, whose own work is now being published and awarded considerably. And so we're so delighted that Moska is part of our team. Hassam Munir is currently pursuing an MA in history at the University of Toronto. He has a broad range of research interests, including reconstructing the history of Muslim communities in Canada and making that knowledge publicly accessible through digital history projects. He is the public relations manager and a research fellow at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research. He previously worked with the Ontario Historical Society. In 2017, he completed a 120-hour archival research project at the Archives of Ontario, which, by the way, is one of our partner organizations here at MiCA engaged in our work. The result of Hassam's work is something he presented at the Active Archives Bringing Ontario's Historian Online Symposium. He was recognized by Heritage Toronto as an emerging historian in 2017 and has experience in the fields of journalism and nonprofit relations. We're so delighted to welcome Hassam to this venue to be part of the Institute's launch of MiCA. And with that, I'll pass things off to Moska to get the webinar started. If you have questions along the way, please post them in the Q&A section and I'll be monitoring them and we'll be happy to moderate the Q&A at the end. Moska, it's all yours.
Thank you, Anver. So I wanted to start off by thanking Hassam for being my co-panelist today and having this very important conversation with me. I thought of you instantly when I was planning this webinar series, considering all the tremendous work you've done in the field of history, especially in the history of Canadian Muslims. So I want to start off by kind of going over the structure of today's webinar. So this is a unique conversation in that you as the audience, you'll be getting perspectives from an archivist and historian, which means that yes, you'll listen to some great stories about Canadian Muslims, but it's also a chance to get a glimpse of the grueling work or behind the scenes, so to speak, of history making and storytelling. So with that, we can start. Let's start from the end. And by that, I mean that Hassam will be sharing 3 stories of early Muslims in Canada, as well as giving a history of Ramadan reported and portrayed through the Western gaze in Toronto. We will then be deconstructing his storytelling and research process to figure out how he pieced together such stories and where archives come or do not come into the picture. By the way, before we start, these stories are online as well, and we'll be sending everyone links in a follow-up email. And with that, I can pass it off to you, Hassam. We can start off with the Love family story.
Thank you, Moska and Anver, for the generous introductions and for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this great initiative. Assalamu alaikum to everyone and the audience as well. And so like Moska said, we start from the stories and then we'll work our way sort of backwards to see how we arrived upon those stories. And the first story that I'd like to talk about is a story you may have heard already, which is the story of the Love family. And I am going to, first of all, give you a summary of what that story is, a general outline of what we know, and then we'll go backwards. So if we could please go to the next slide. The Love family are known as the first Muslims in Canada, according to the records. Now, it's important to note that there may have been Muslims prior to the Love family in the land that currently constitutes Canada, present here and making their contributions here and building their lives here. And we do know of some of those stories, particularly of peoples of African descent, such as Richard Pierrepoint and Muhammad Bakwakwa, who were brought through the transatlantic slave trade, not directly to Canada, but to other parts of the Americas, and eventually made their way to Canada and spent some time here in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. But the first record we have of individuals specifically identifying themselves as Muslims and not just being people who potentially were of Muslim background, which is the case for Pierrepoint and Bakwakwa, is of the Love family. And this essentially is their story. So as you can see in the timeline before you, in the 1820s and 1830s, we have these 2 individuals who are both born in Scotland. One of them is named James Love, and the other one is named Agnes Garland. And eventually, they both move to Canada, and they settle in Ontario. And in 1851, they get married in Canada. Potentially, there's a question mark there, right? So there's a lot of question marks in these stories, which we'll get into later on and why that's the case. In 1853, their son is born. James Love Jr. is born in the Rockwood, Ontario area, which is close to Guelph. In 1871, so you see we're making major kind of jumps in the time scale here because of the few details that we have available about the story of these people. But in 1871, this is essentially the crux of why this story is so interesting to the Muslim community, because James, Agnes, and their first 8 children who had been born by that point were identified as Muhammadan in the census, which is a sort of archaic way of saying Muslim, the word Muhammadan. And James filled in the census record. You actually had to fill it in by hand, and he identified his on behalf of his wife Agnes, as well as his first 8 children, that they were Muhammadans. And another interesting detail is that James lists his occupation at the time as a farmer, and also that he identifies himself as living in Peel region, which was slightly different from the Peel region we have today, but roughly the same area. Now, in 1911, after another huge jump in time, after a significant amount of time has passed, James and Agnes, we know, who are now elderly, are living in Toronto with some of their children. And in 1917, James passes away. And in 1922, Agnes passes away. And they are buried along with some of their children in the Prospect Cemetery in downtown Toronto. And so this is essentially, in a nutshell, the story of the Love family. And these are the details that we know. There are a lot of gaps, which only, I think, underscores the emphasis that we are trying to make here on the importance of keeping records, right? Because this family didn't necessarily keep any personal records that contributed to us finding this story, but these were official government records that have given us all of this information, which we can talk about if we move on to the next slide. I can actually show you. So this is a digitized version of the original census, recording from 1871. And this is essentially the part I've highlighted is, I know it's very difficult to read no matter how much you try to zoom in, but that top line, it says Love, surname first, and then James, and his details are filled in completely. And over here in the middle there in the religion column, as you can see, that's where he's written Muhammadan, and then he lists his wife Agnes and then his 8 children. And he identifies them all by this same kind of religious affiliation, that they are Muhammadan. Now, I did not come across this story this way. I came across the story through the work of Dr. Dawood Hamdani, who was, his legacy and his work was discussed in more detail in the previous webinar, which I'm sure you can find online, as Moska suggested. Dr. Hamdani had, of course, done this research, and I first heard of it in the published form, in journal form, in the Journal of the Institute of Muslim Minority Affairs, where he had originally published basically just like a couple of sentences summarizing not even the information I've just given you, but just essentially pointing out that in the 1871 census, there were a certain number of people, a family who identified as Muhammadan, and the parents in that family were James and Agnes Love. And so to further build upon that, that was an important contribution because it helped me get started. And it gave me a clue, right? And oftentimes this is all we as historians have to work with, but this is why archival records are so important, because all those clues do eventually add up. And so what I did after finding that clue was then starting to search with the resources that are available. And we live at a time in history when resources are perhaps more accessible in many ways, especially through digitization and through indexing online and through various platforms that have been developed, that we can find information much more easily in many ways than we would in the past. So I started my search on ancestry.com, seeing if I could find any family trees, of the Love family, and eventually, just based on the details I had found in Brother Hamdani's work, essentially just their names and where they had lived in certain parts. So using some of those key details, I was able to narrow down the search. And because of course, many people have the last name Love, and there's a lot of people who are named James Love, even in the 18th century, even in the ancestry.com records, etc. So I was able to narrow down, and then eventually through narrowing down, I was able to find the Love family, especially James and Agnes Love, and identify their entire family and find an actual copy of the census records, which, as far as I'm aware, is what Dawood Hamdani had relied upon as well. The original census records, really the paper you're looking at right now on the slide. And so that becomes like another, you get some more clues from that. So some of the details that Dr. Hamdani had not chosen to mention in his final published work were now available to me. So building on that, I found some more information about the children that the Love couple lived with in their later years in Toronto. And using that information, I went on a website called findagrave.com. Get straight to the point, and using the information I had available, I was able to actually narrow down where they were buried, as I said, in Prospect Cemetery. And then when I went to the cemetery, and through the help of the cemetery staff, I was able to really find their final resting place. That essentially the monument that's there is giving me even further information, because there's other details that are recorded on it that I had not seen anywhere, right? So this has really been a process of picking up the clues in different places. And then on top of that, just building around it. So my initial assumption, so I'll give you one example, is where does the name Love come from, right? And it's like, oh, well, they were from Scotland. They probably spoke, Scottish, which is not too different from English. Like, it's probably just the word love, like, affection, but the more research you do, and as you try to dig into every aspect of the bits of information you have about them, as it turns out, in Scotland, the Love family is actually just a form of the French word Louis, meaning wolf, right? So it's related to certain German families. It's related to certain French families through the Norman conquest. It's related to certain Scottish families. There were a couple named Adam and Mary Love, who about 100 years before James and Agnes Love, they were the first settlers of the Love family to move from Scotland to Rhode Island in the United States. So you start to put together all of these details, right? And you start to look at, okay, what other information can we find? What do we know about Scottish immigrants to Canada in general in the 19th century? What do we know about Scottish immigrants to Canada who had a similar kind of trajectory, right? And a similar example for, one of the people I was kind of comparing to, just based on my own interest in the sport of basketball, was James Naismith, the inventor of the sport of basketball, because he had a very similar backstory, right? He was also from the same generation as the James and Agnes Love children would have been of. Very similar kind of story. Parents come from Scotland, settle in Ontario. They are farmers, and then their children, including James Naismith, go on to do something else. So essentially, like, this is what the process is. The point I'm trying to really make here is that it all started with this one document for both Dr. Dawood Hamdani, who introduced these people to me, and then and not at a personal level. He had just published it and I happened to come across it, and that's how that connection was made. And then me also having to go back to this one key document and these few lines in one document, which you might initially look at and say, well, okay, there's some information here, but it's just, you know, what can we really make of this? But when you start to gather like the surrounding information and really pursue it, this is how history is developed, and this is how, you know, I continue to search for clues, and I can never really say that, okay, we know all there is to know about this story, right? We continue to try to get in touch with their descendants, right, of the Love family. We continue to try to see what other information we can find in more maybe local archives in places like Rockwood or Guelph or Zurich, Ontario, or, you know, the Peel archives, etc. Anything that we may be able to find. And it would not be surprising if eventually we can go from this one few lines on a piece of paper from 1871 to an entire book, or a very detailed journal article or magazine article or something about the Love family, right? So this is one example of the Love family that I really want to emphasize. And there's a few other examples that really give us a better sense of other aspects of this process that I guess we can now move on to.
I realized that I may have missed a slide, but was there? Oh, we already saw the slide. Never mind.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I knew of the story. I just wanted to say that I knew of the story just from my own conversation with the late Dr. Hamdani last year, but this is probably the first time I'm hearing it in such detail, and especially in how the story came about. So and I find it especially important how I just found it really important to note how you kind of added on to Dr. Hamdani's work, essentially not completing the timeline, but, you know, adding to the timeline, because like you did say that the next step after the visit to the cemetery is to talk to the descendants, which are American, I think you mentioned.
Right.
Some
Most of them
being,
are in the
yeah.
United States. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And we don't have the rich details of their lives quite yet, but I think thanks to your digging, we're able to kind of add on to this specific family's timeline, and I really like that, the addition like that. But I had a really big question. So, oh well, actually, before we do that, I want to just do a recap of the types of sources that were used to tell this story. So census records, family trees, ancestry.com specifically, cemetery records when you physically have to go to a cemetery, online family histories, the library. That's a lot, and that's just to figure out this timeline that you showed us, right? So and not the finer details of their lives that we're now super interested in. Can you give us an idea maybe how long maybe your part took? You know, obviously Dr. Hamdani started it all, but I'm wondering how long it took you to piece together the rest of the story that we have now.
I've been working on it essentially since 2015 until now, and not intensively working on it, you know, working on a lot of different projects, and this is just something I keep at the back of my mind. And, you know, sometimes I'll go back and maybe spend a night just digging again on the internet to see what else I can find. But it's a constant process, right? And the trick is to look in the most unlikely of places, right? And also, I guess from the perspective of appreciating what archives can do is, and how we can contribute to them, is this idea that a lot of things that have helped me put together this story, when I try to think about it, and I try to think about a moment in a person's life when he or she finds something that is personally important to them, but they're thinking, I don't know if this is ever going to be important to anyone else. You know, I might as well just shred it or you know, burn it or whatever, right? Like, it's time to let go of this. But you never know how much of a difference preserving that piece of paper or that artifact or whatever it is going to make a difference in ways that maybe you've never imagined, if only if it were to be preserved, right? Or if you would even think in that direction. So I'm very grateful to all of the people. You know, I'm the one who's searching, but there are a lot of people who have maybe taken an extra step and gone out of their way throughout the decades for more than a century to say, okay, let's save this somehow. Maybe it'll be someday relevant, right? And this is the case with a lot of stories in Canadian Muslim history and any history, really.
So before we move on to the next stories, I was wondering if you could, so first, like, how in the world did you figure out to like look through cemetery records, first of all? I mean, I know you mentioned the findagrave.com. What is the process there from findagrave.com? How does that even work? Like where, I guess, yeah, I guess I'm asking, how did you think to look for that, I suppose? And where did that, how
Well,
did it get to you
that's one of
going
the
to the
first.
cemetery?
Sorry. Yeah, like you're saying, you know, it's when we're buried, there's a tendency when you have like a certain kind of some form of monument or cenotaph or something built. There is a tendency, I think, in many cultures to record something on that is you know, some essential information about the person's life, right? Like what the people at the time of burial considered important, right? And we'll record that, right? So certain details will emerge from that. So I think in general, that's one of the first places historians will look, right? Because if you have no other information about a person, it's like, okay, at least when they passed away, their loved ones or somebody what may have thought, it's highly likely in many cultures, in many cultural settings, that they may have thought, okay, let's record certain information on whatever it is that we're placing, you know, in different cultures and religion, there's different things, right? But whatever it is that they're placing, we're at the site of burial. So what I didn't know is where they were buried, which was the problem, right? And for a long time, I couldn't search because I had no idea that they spent their last years in Toronto. And I was very fortunate that I myself live in Toronto, and it literally took me no time to get from my room to the cemetery where they were buried and actually see that burial site for myself. And so that was essentially narrowing it down. Once I knew they were buried in Toronto, I could really go on a site like findagrave.com, and they basically catalog cemetery records and search, you know, now I'm not just looking for James Love, I'm looking for James Love in Toronto. I know they were buried somewhere in Toronto. So once it starts to get narrowed down, it becomes a lot easier, but definitely one of the first places that we would look for information.
Okay. And again, I'm going to pause before we go to the next one, because I just want to comment on the fact that I especially like that it is like Muslims that did this work, you know, uncovering the history of some of the very first Muslims, so both you and Dr. Hamdani, because just in general, who else is it more relevant to than Canadian Muslims, the story? I think it's very powerful to have Muslims tell the stories of Muslims as opposed to, and I know I keep saying this, as opposed to non-Muslims who may not be aware of cultural, religious protocols, and also may not appreciate or be able to connect or even care as strongly as a fellow Muslim. Fellow Muslims who don't often see themselves in the Canadian historical record. But on that note, we can move on to the next one. Now, on the note of talking about non-Muslims telling our stories, let's move on to a very interesting topic on the history of how Ramadan was documented by non-Muslims in Toronto. Okay, I will go to the next slide. We're going to start off with the history of Ramadan, then move on to two very early Muslims who wrote memoirs about themselves, HANNY, SHOUSHER, and Peter Baker. So take it away, Hassam. This is very interesting.
Yeah, so if you could go to the next slide. There we go. So this is an interesting project I did about 3 years ago. I remember it was really fun, and it was done around Ramadan time. So like Moska, you just mentioned that it's the personal experiences that often drive us to see. It's like, okay, so how did a Muslim feel about Ramadan like 70 years ago, right, in Toronto? What was their experience like compared to mine, etc. And it's that kind of curiosity that often drives these searches. This one was fairly easy, but it shows, it gives us again an appreciation for an archive. ProQuest has set up an archive of newspapers, basically, and they've digitized it, and it's available to me as a university student. And so I just went through the ProQuest historical archives and searched up Ramadan, right? And I narrowed down my search to certain newspapers in Toronto that had been, that are basically in that archive, that they've been along for that much time. And I was really surprised. It was really easy, like I mentioned, because as you can see, even in these pictures here, it's just highlighted, right? The word Ramadan is highlighted because I was basically just running a precision search. But if you think about all of the stories that kind of come out of it, and having no other recourse on the history of Muslims in Toronto in general, which has been fairly well documented since the 1960s or so, but before that, we have very little information. But this became a search that was very fruitful, I thought, and a great way to use, or a kind of glimpse at how someone in the future might use archival sources. So just quickly running through the timeline here, again, in 1897, the Evening Star, which is the precursor to the Toronto Star, it mentioned Ramadan as part of covering a conflict in Ottoman Turkey. So this was there. It's like, oh yeah, there's a war going on in like the Middle East, and there's also like people fasting, right? So, and then just filling it in the 1910s, we have a record of Rajib Asim, who was an early Muslim settler in Toronto, a pioneer of the Toronto Muslim community. He arrived as a political refugee from Albania, right? So I just wanted to place that in there for context. That's not something I found through this, but it helps us explain that there were Muslims, or at least one Muslim that we know of, everything after the 1910s. And perhaps he was reading all of these articles and wondering like, what the heck is going on, right? This is maybe missing the point of Ramadan a little bit. So even in the 1920s, the late 1920s, the Toronto Daily Star, again, the other name for the precursor of the Toronto Star of today, it was quizzing readers about Ramadan. So there was an actual quiz, you know how they have at the back of the newspapers. And one of the questions was, what is Ramadan? And the answer was 9th month of the Mohammedan calendar, right? So again, missing the point of, you know, a little bit. It's like, okay, well, what does that mean, right? Like, what's the significance of it? But they also did cover Eid that year, and they mentioned, as you can see here, they mentioned Ramadan very briefly, but they're not covering Eid or Ramadan as observed in Canada or in Toronto. They're mentioning it as international news, that Eid was observed in the United Kingdom, right? And then it's really in the 1950s, late 1950s and 1957, that we get this really interesting article in the Globe and Mail reporting that, you know, 30 Muslims gathered to pray in Kingsway Hall, which was like a musical hall that was very famous in Toronto for a long time. Probably is, you know, the person describing it, the journalist, is like probably the first Muslim congregational service held in the city. There's around 500 Muslims living in Toronto at the time. And one of the attendees says, and I love this quote, he says, perhaps someday we shall have a mosque in Toronto. And as we know today, there are a lot of mosques in Toronto, right? And so it continues. So in 1973, there's another article outlining for the first time really the spiritual significance of Ramadan for Muslims. And you can see this is a way it gives us clues into the growth of the Muslim community and how much the general Canadian population was becoming aware of the Muslim community. In 1977, though, it was still very much a curiosity. Like University of Toronto professor Qadir Beg, who's many of you in the audience may have actually met or known, he hosted an iftar in his downtown apartment to celebrate the completion of his daughter's first fast. And this was a big enough or an interesting enough thing, again, for there to be a media coverage of it, which is, I find fascinating, right? And then in 1979, a journalist, now a Muslim journalist, Sidney Zaidi, who was living in Toronto, he organized a Quran exhibition at Toronto's harbourfront, right? So this is all fairly early on, and I stopped my search at the 1980s because I really wanted to focus on the early history. But the idea again was about the Western gaze. So a journalist was there covering all of these events, but what did they choose to focus on? And that's what they chose to preserve in their records. And these are the records that are used not just by me, but also by other researchers perhaps. And this is what they are going to develop narratives and develop histories based on. But what was there in the records in the first place really depends on who was creating those records, who was contributing those records, who was preserving these moments in history. And so you'll find all kinds of interesting things. You can actually see here in the bottom picture, like the main picture that they've used, one of them is of course people making prostration, making sajda, but the other one is just a picture of shoes. And there's like this constant fixation on, oh, Muslims line up their shoes and take them off, and then they go inside, right? And you can see in the top picture here as well, there's shoes in the picture. Like this is just like a point of fascination, right? So if we were to tell these same stories, what other things might we emphasize? How would we tell them differently? If we were creating our own records and somebody in the year 2220, like 200 years from now, we're looking at those records, would we really be fixating on the fact that the shoes were really well lined up at the mosque in the 27th night of Ramadan, or would we focus on something different, right? So this is why I wanted to really bring attention to this story as well.
Thank you, Hassam. So I also found it super interesting because I read through. So Hassam actually wrote a short article about this on his website, which we'll give the link to everyone later. But it was really interesting how you pointed out the shoes situation. It was super fascinating. They're so focused on that. But generally, from learning about the story, I got the idea that, you know, Toronto residents kind of, at least through newspapers, learned about Ramadan, starting with reports about Eid, and then slowly becoming, you know, more curious enough to learn about why Eid comes about, and that's where like they've learned more about Ramadan. I also found it interesting that as a side, we also kind of were able to track the number of Muslims in Toronto throughout the years from offhand comments like that. You know, there's 500 Muslims at this time, I think, in 1957. And I think in the following articles, the number goes up and up. And we can kind of, that's just my point is just that, you know, it's an interesting example of how you never know how your stuff can be useful in the future, even though the focus of those articles were not the numbers of Toronto Muslims. We're able to kind of track that as a side. But yeah, I know you mentioned that you used ProQuest, and I don't know if everybody would know what ProQuest is, but would you be able to just talk about that source specifically?
Yeah, so ProQuest is a database, a research database. They do many different kinds of work. Somebody's asking if it's a database of U of T. I'm not quite sure about that. Certainly U of T.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't believe so either, but they're gracious enough to give me access at least. And yeah, so ProQuest has, so it's a database with kind of, I guess, sub databases, if that's a term, right? Which organize different kinds of records. So they have newspaper archives, they have image archives, they have journal article kind of journal records. So it's a database of a very large database, one of the more prominent ones. It has great search features, so if you can get access to it, it's a great place to start research. And it's very helpful.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think one of the points I wanted to focus on the fact that you do need to be like a student to access it, or like there's a paywall in between you and ProQuest. Though I'm not sure, you might be able to access it through library, like the public library card or not. I'm not sure.
I don't believe so.
No. Oh, so it's just universal. So again, just focusing on like the idea that there is a paywall to a lot of this information. But another question I had was like, were you just keyword searching Ramadan in the database? Is that how all these came up?
Yeah, you can see it's highlighted in pink at any time the word Ramadan
Yeah.
is mentioned, because that's, I literally just put the word Ramadan in there and I put which newspapers I wanted to run a search through. And to my surprise, to be honest, I wasn't expecting there to be much, but a lot of articles ran through the search. So yeah, somebody's saying, thank God for OCR. I agree.
Did you want to move on to the next stories?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's go. Okay, so HANNY, SHOUSHER, and Peter Baker.
Okay, so these are two stories I wanted to tell concurrently, just because there's a lot of great stories to tell. We don't have a lot of time, so just like to keep this rolling. So HANNY, SHOUSHER, and Peter Baker are both early settlers, early Muslim settlers in Canada. HANNY, SHOUSHER in London, Ontario, which you may know is one of the oldest established, I guess we could say, communities of Muslims in Canada, going back to the very early 1900s. And Peter Baker, who had ties to the Alberta community, which again, as we know, is very long and well established. And he, of course, was tied to that community, but spent much of his time in relative isolation from the community because he was so remote in the Northwest Territories. So in 1902, SHOUSHER's father arrives in Canada and settles in Kirkland Lake, Ontario as a laborer, but eventually it seems he moved back to Lebanon because that's where SHOUSHER was born later on, as we'll get into. 1909, meanwhile, Ahmed Ali Farran, who has to take the name Peter Baker at some point in his life, just to make life a little easier and to get through certain doors and to become part of certain conversations. He arrives in Halifax, and then he moves for some time to the United States, and then eventually he moves to British Columbia, where he loses all his money in 1921 that he saved up through doing labor, essentially, but he loses it in gambling. And he finds himself homeless in Alert Bay, which is an island in British Columbia. And there's this fascinating story about how a local lady who he used to help out basically helped him out and got him off the street and gave him some money, essentially a loan, to get back to Edmonton and connect with the Muslim community there, and how really ardent he was in making sure that she received the repayment of that loan. But anyways, in 1920s, Baker became a very prominent merchant in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, which is a trading outpost, primarily bringing goods from Alberta up north and trading with Indigenous peoples. So he was involved in the fur trade, developed very close ties with the Indigenous people and learned Indigenous languages like Slavey. And he also faced anti-Semitism, right, which is fascinating because at the time, Islamophobia in Canada wasn't really a thing because there didn't seem to be a lot of Muslims that people engaged with, or there were Muslims and they just couldn't tell the difference. But anti-Semitism was quite a problem. And so one of the things that, competitors or people who, and we'll go into Peter Baker's story, there's a lot of details that we know that he recorded himself, but they would basically call him like, spread rumors that he's a Jew, basically, right? And maybe in the Q&A, we can go into like why that happened and why that was problematic. In 1926, Baker confronted Canada's Interior Minister, Charles Stewart, on discriminatory laws, especially against independent traders like him. In 1930, SHOUSHER, so now we're going back to HANNY SHOUSHER, he's born in Lebanon, and when he's 19, he moves to London, Ontario, and he's lived there ever since, and he is still with us. In 1964, now Baker, after a considerable amount of time has passed, he becomes the first Muslim elected to public office in Canada in the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, and he passes away in 1973. He's buried next to the first mosque in Canada, which was built in Edmonton, the Al Rashid Mosque. And there's a lot of details on SHOUSHER's life as well. Of course, I couldn't list all of them, but SHOUSHER was basically a community person. In 1989, he compiles a directory of the Muslim community as much as he was aware of it in Southern Ontario. And this is from a magazine called The Link Canada, which was a sort of Muslim community magazine that was published for many years out of London, Ontario. And they did a feature on SHOUSHER. So that's SHOUSHER there. And here he's holding a picture of his parents, who he came with when he came as a 19-year-old in 1949 and settled in London, Ontario. But the person, Leila Al-Mavi, who wrote this feature and went to visit him, essentially says that his basement is just like it's an archive, right? It's a treasure trove. Like, he has not thrown out anything. And he has kept, you can even see him there just with like the pictures actually of the Link Canada magazine. Like, it's not even his own stuff, but he has all these magazines and everything that he could find, he preserved it. You can see cameras. So one of the things Leila mentioned in her article was that there were so many cameras, and the camera roll, like, they're just rooms in his basement just full of old cameras, right? So essentially, these are in a nutshell, stories of two people. And we can go into the sources if we go to the next slide, because I want to give you a sense of how these stories are compiled, right? So this is basically writing your own memoir, writing your own story and contributing it. And it's very important, I think, for us to reflect on the fact that they were not shy, or they did not make this a point of, which is a thing in the Muslim community, I think, that we need to think a bit differently about, perhaps, about humility, about, how we are often very self-effacing, like, we as individuals are not important and our stories are not important, etc. But at some level, those stories are extremely important, especially for future generations to make use of in many different ways. So Peter Baker, you can see his book here. He wrote Memoirs of an Arctic Arab, the story of a free trader in Northern Canada for the years, and he covers the years 1907 to 1927. So this is very early on, around a century ago, what was a Muslim doing as a free trader in the Northwest Territories. And he actually started this by writing for a local newspaper in Yellowknife, which is eventually where he settled. He would basically, on a weekly basis, he had his own column, I guess we would call it, or he serialized his story. And then eventually, when he passed away, one of his friends took all of those and compiled a book for us. And that's the book that we can read today. It's actually a fascinating read of his experiences. Similarly, for HANNY SHOUSHER, I actually have the book right here with me, and it's not doing too well. It passed several hands before it got to me. But I'm wondering if I can actually open it. That's a very poor picture, but if I open it and actually go through this book, I don't know how clearly you guys can see it, but he literally just scanned all the documents related to the London Muslim community that he had in his basement with the help of his daughter Nadia. And they'd scanned like every single document, any pictures that they could find, and whatever else that they were able to put in this book. And there's not much text in this book. It's just like a book that has recorded the history, like letters to mayors and letters from mayors, and meeting minutes of the early Muslim organizations in London, Ontario. So what he did was he presented us with this archive. The lesson in these kinds of, I think, the stories of the Muslims and their experience of Ramadan, as well as HANNY SHOUSHER's experience of decades in the London Muslim community, and Peter Baker's experience in the Northwest Territories in Alberta, is how helpful it can be to record your own story and tell your story to the world.
So I was actually going to just say, Hassam, so thank you for those, talking about the stories. I was going to say that book is literally what an archive is. So minus the scanning into a book, all those records that are scanned in that book right now could essentially be a physical archive in itself, and that's what an archive is. And not everybody has the capacity to be able to scan and publish, and those are very expensive things to do. The alternative is to donate your records so that a dedicated archive can preserve those records. Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like a lot of Canadian Muslims are creating these memoirs and are doing this archival work without even knowing that they are doing that when they write their own books, right? And I was going to ask you actually if, other than the personal recollections, like what other primary sources these folks use to tell their stories, but you literally just opened up and showed me. So basically their own archival materials that they collected over the years is essentially how they wrote these books, right? And Peter Baker is it mostly personal recollections?
Yeah, so he was writing from memory, and he was serializing in a Yellowknife newspaper his story, which eventually just became chapters of the book, every serial, basically.
Oh, okay. So essentially, I think, I can move on to the next slide, but unless Hassam had anything else to say about these stories.
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Well, right. So this slide kind of gives an idea of the breadth of sources that were used to write these memoirs, and especially the Ramadan, the situation about the Ramadan throughout time in Toronto, newspaper archives. So online newspaper archives specifically. And I noticed oral histories too. I think you did use an oral history project, I think, for something here.
Yes, I did. I'm actually having a hard time recalling which one of these it was.
I think it was about the Dundas Street Mosque.
Yeah, you're right.
Or the Dundas Street, yes.
Yeah, that's correct. The history of Muslims in Canada, sorry, in Toronto specifically. They had done a project just recording the oral history. I think it's called Mosque One, the project itself, that's what it's called. And they did a great job recording the oral history, which was another source. So it's just the diversity of sources having to come together to tell a single story, which just underscores the importance of maintaining and preserving all of those sources.
Yes, and that was the Tesla Institute who did the Mosque One project. And I think the point of this conversation so far is just to emphasize the like Hassam said, the breadth of sources that were used. And these sources that tell our stories, Canadian Muslim stories, are spread out. They're spread out throughout the country. They're online. They're on multiple different mediums, institutions, places. And I think we can all kind of agree in an attempt to bring all these kinds of sources in one place can really improve access to primary sources that historians such as Hassam, community members such as everybody here on this call, artists, writers, and more and anybody can use to present our stories and bring them into the spotlight. I think that's one of the major issues here. It's especially crucial to tell our stories in this heightened age of Islamophobia and to really bring them to the spotlight. Our stories aren't mainstream at the moment, and when we are in the mainstream, media portrayals of Muslims are kind of saturated with representations and stories centered on what Dr. Emon was saying earlier. They're centered on terrorism, violence, extremism, war, and the point of an archive and kind of the gist of what we're trying to say here is that to resist these kinds of narratives and to resist the onslaught of these one-sided, often negative representations, we can do that by telling our stories in our own words through archives. But one of the ways that this is currently being done so far is through an initiative that Hassam actually started a while ago called iHistory. So I wonder if Hassam, you want to talk a little bit about iHistory. So,
Sure.
I know we've been talking about archives this entire time, but I also want to just highlight how Hassam has been doing this shifting narratives about Muslims in Canada through his personally by himself on his own through iHistory.
Yeah, certainly. So iHistory is sort of a public history project, which I began several years ago. And it's really built around a blog called iHistory, but over time I've had the opportunity to basically make history more accessible in other ways, as well as you know, by giving myself the creative control by basically just making it my own project, I've had the opportunity to pursue a lot of stories that may have otherwise not been pursued. So, you know, and that's how I've come to publish much of my work on the history of Muslims in Canada there, which is, again, like an important reminder of how we as individuals can play our role in making history, right? When I started, I wasn't a history student. I was actually a journalism student when I started the iHistory project. I just had a curiosity about history. And yes, there are times when there's kind of like a moment, it's like of imposter syndrome kicking in. It's like, and I think this happens perhaps with many people in the community or even at an organizational level, which is that, well, we're not professional historians. We don't know how to, you know, basically do all of this stuff of preserving and contributing records and organizing our stuff, and then developing our own history. A lot of About Me pages on a lot of mosques and a lot of organizations don't have a lot of detail on how it came to be, etc. Because I think there is a hesitation to go in that direction based on this idea that you know, we can't do this well enough, right? But that's something that I think personally I felt as well, and sometimes still do feel, but I challenge it. And eventually it was my work as an amateur historian that inspired me to start pursuing history professionally, right? And I think this is a way perhaps to introduce a lot of young people in the Muslim community to this field on how rich and interesting and exciting this kind of work can be and how you can actually pursue it as a career. And so iHistory has become the conduit through which all of the research, like the stories I just described, have led to other kinds of knowledge mobilization kind of projects in which we take that information and then turn it into things like exhibits, turn it into things like walking tours, turn it into things like even like international lectures. Like I was invited last year in 2019 to present on the history of Muslims in Canada in Washington, D.C., for the American Islamic Heritage Museum, right? So they were suddenly very curious about, oh yeah, like first of all, for Americans, there's like, oh yeah, there's a place called Canada, or, you know, and then it was really shocking for them that, oh, there's a history of Muslims in Canada, like a real long, very interesting history. And they were very intrigued by that. And I found through all of these projects, every time I do it, I actually learn more. So when I did the exhibit a few years ago, I made this massive timeline on the history of Muslims in Canada with just the rough details that I had been able to compile at the time. I presented it at the International Halal Food Festival, which used to take place, I guess, before this year, annually in Toronto. Food festival in Canada, and I just had like a stall there and I was presenting it, and so many people stopped by, and literally there were people like, oh, that's my uncle in the picture, right? And then through like that, I got to learn so much more. I made so many connections to people who led me to more historical information. You know, to give you one example of the entire process of what this can be, the archivals, somebody made an effort to archive the history of Muslims in Toronto as it pertains to Ramadan, like the sources I showed you. So I took that and turned it into an article, and then I took the article and turned it into a social media campaign, and that came to the attention of somebody, one of the editors at the Canadian Encyclopedia, who asked me to write an article for the Canadian Encyclopedia on the history of Ramadan in Canada. So this is how we go from archival sources to learning our own history within the community, to making enough noise about it to you know, get the attention of the wider society and make it go more mainstream, right? And there's so many different examples of things that can go from the archive to like a feature film, to like a Netflix series, to a documentary, to a play, to a book, to a children's book, like so many things that they can be turned into, right? So that's what iHistory has really enabled me to do.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of go over things a little bit more faster because we do have a few interesting things to go over later on. But So another, aside from eye history, like Hassam said, like um, an archive can help us, shift these narratives, and through that we gain our narrative power. So I'll go over a little bit about what MiCA is, the Muslims in Canada Archive. So we're a collaborative and participatory archival initiative out of the Institute of Islamic Studies at U of T to collect and share the history and documentary heritage of Canadian Muslim communities. And MiCA tells stories through your archival records. But what is an archival record, you may ask? And so here's actually a list of potential archival records. So the events and activities of your lives are captured through what in the archives world, so in my world as an archivist, we call archival records. But really these are things that are found in your own home, such as documents, paper documents, photographs, postcards, DVDs, VHS tapes, meeting minutes, and whatnot. Even Hassam showed us like that scan of meeting minutes in I think it was HANNY SHOUSHER's book. Yes, it was HANNY SHOUSHER's book. But here's a short list of possible archival records that you may have, and these items have value for the future. And I promise you that some of you may have everything on here, or maybe not everything specifically on here, but they will have most of these types of records in your own homes. It might not be, enough for me to convince you of the archival value of your records. It might even be difficult for you to fathom what an archive is or why you should use archival materials. Maybe you're thinking, who could possibly use my records to tell a unique story? But one of the reasons I asked Hassam to join me in this conversation is because he is a historian, as much as he tries to not call himself that and has imposter syndrome. But historians use archival records, so I thought it would be really interesting to have a historian, as you saw, show us how one way archival records are used. But like he said, you don't need to be a historian to use archives, and not at all, actually. And so I did want to ask Hassam some questions about how, he started off using archival records. So do you remember the first time maybe that you used archives and what your experience was? Because it is hard sometimes in the very beginning for people to understand how to approach an archive and how to, what exists in one and what the process is. It seems a little bit daunting sometimes.
Yeah, certainly. So first of all, from my perspective as a historian, about my experience of using archives, like was mentioned in my introduction, I think I worked with the Ontario Historical Society while I was an undergraduate student at York University to do a lot of archival research at the Archives of Ontario. And it's really a grudging and grueling process from the perspective of a historian. While there is a general appreciation that somebody actually took the time to preserve these records and people took the initiative to contribute these records for preservation. So I spent like 70 to 80 hours going through early records of the Ontario Historical Society and trying to reconstruct a social media project on the history of the OHS. And while doing that, it was like, what am I doing here? I'm looking at correspondence. People are like writing letters, like handwritten letters saying like, I live in Kingston. I'm not going to be able to come down for the annual general meeting because there's a lot of snow and anything can happen to like the train on the road and it's too dangerous, right? And I'm like, and that was one of the more interesting things, which is why I remember it. But a lot of it was even more like, drudgery than that. But that being said, like that is the starting point when we are trying to reconstruct history. Like we have to go through those sources, and just because something isn't immediately relevant or interesting to me, right, as a historian, doesn't mean that it won't be for another historian, right? And keep in mind when we say historian, it gives a certain kind of image because I think we often kind of fail to appreciate how much of our culture is shaped by history, how much of our understanding of ourselves is shaped by history. So like I mentioned earlier, right, archives can be used by historians, genealogists, by journalists, right? People mapping family trees. They're used for legal purposes, such as land allotments and other kinds of legal disputes. They're used by individuals to learn their own family history. And think about the next stage. So whatever historians are producing, and sometimes it's a direct relationship. Like there have been cases in which people are working on a feature film or like a feature, like a filmmaking project, and they've gone directly to the archives, or they've had someone on their team go directly into the archives and do the kind of research required to really bring out some of the details that they want to emphasize. But oftentimes it's mediated by historians. So it's not just that you'll help like a guy like Hassam Munir write a book about the Love family, but it's also about the next stage. Once that book or that article is written, what else could it turn into, right? Like I mentioned earlier, children's books, right? All kinds of creative products, all kinds of media products, all kinds of educational products could go into curriculums, could go into teaching materials. Many things can happen, and this is how we mainstream our stories. So for the question of who usually uses archives, I think it's important to keep in mind the entire web of people who use archives, and not just the people who are using it most immediately, right? And I think that helps add a bit more encouragement to basically trying to engage with the archive and contribute to it. If we're talking about like what are they used for, I think that question is kind of addressed in my answer to the previous question. Learning history, and you know, when you think about that, don't think about your mandatory grade 10 Ontario curriculum history course, right? Where it was like very specific about what was being learned. Think about more deeply about how history shapes the culture around you and your own life in so many different ways at every moment in life. And I think there's a general tendency among the public to not have an awareness. Their archives need to do a better job, perhaps, of actually going out into communities and engaging communities, working with individuals who have curiosity or who have records to contribute or anything along those lines, and actually introducing them to what an archive is. I mean, I often share this example of like, when do you hear about archives in popular culture or in everyday conversation? Like the word does not really come up. Sometimes like there's some familiarity, like web archives, like there's like some way kind of familiarity, but the archive we're talking about specifically, not really, right? And I remember the example from the movie of Angels and Demons when Professor Robert Langdon is like trying to get into the Vatican archives to do like his top-notch research, and while he's in there, somebody cuts off the air supply, and then he's like dying in there and like firing bullets. And like, it's not going to be that exciting, but it is like, the image that's created of archives being this very kind of, you have to be a specialist and you have to get into like all kinds of funny business to be engaging with an archive. But really archives behind the scenes play a huge role in telling us a lot about the past, and through doing so, telling us a lot about ourselves and helping us tell our stories and chart our futures. And so, it's not just about that, but also about raising awareness in general. I think particularly within communities and then within the school system. So if anyone in the audience who is connected to the education system, like maybe our history teaching has to be a bit less about this is what happened in history and a little bit more about this is how history is produced. And maybe that will inspire a lot of curiosity among students to really create general awareness in society about what archives are and why they are so useful.
Oh yeah, 100%. I think it's very important for young people to learn, especially in this age of fake news and whatnot. The idea of learning about how history is created, because it's important to know about the role of valid sources and evidence of activities. If you learn how history is produced, you're better equipped to figure out where the gaps are and to critically analyze the information in front of you, right? So, but I totally agree. In archival outreach strategies to marginalized and underrepresented communities, such as Canadian Muslim communities, they are in their infancy and they're not always effective. So in the interest of time, we will move on to just really quickly going over how MiCA specifically can serve Canadian Muslim communities. In my own opinion, I wanted to just quickly go over some like futures and possibilities of MiCA. But so personally, I really hope that that MiCA can become just more than just an archive, but a site of education and awareness. By education, I mean I hope that MiCA can find itself in a position to maybe, like you said, teach classes about archival research, that behind the scenes look that we basically went over today. Maybe an artist can draw inspiration from items in MiCA's collections for our next art piece, or I'm just giving some examples, just like you did, Hassam. But I essentially would love to see MiCA as a space for community unity and mobilization. So as we learn about our histories, we can relate through them with each other and build informed and connected futures. But honestly, the possibilities are pretty much endless. We've only gave a small handful of examples of what archives can do and how MiCA can serve its communities, but it's really up to you all, the community, to tell us what you'd like to see out of MiCA. We are here as an archive to serve you. And I just wanted to quickly pass it on to Anver, if you don't have anything else to say, Hassam, because Anver did want to talk about the more concrete plans that we have here at MiCA for the future. But Anver, if you can quickly do that so that we can move on to the Q&A, because I think we do have some questions.
Absolutely, I would be delighted. First, let me thank Hassam very much for joining us this evening and for sharing the stories. There's a lot of questions in the Q&A, and so I want to make sure we get to them. And so I'm happy to have that interest generated. Just a couple, just brief updates on MiCA itself. Right now, we are in the process of acquiring document collections. So for many of you, looking at Nina's point in the chat, she's talking about her family history coming from the former Yugoslavia. And one of the things we would welcome you, Nina, and others, is to get in touch with us, talk to us. We're curious about what kind of records are there that you might have access to. We're meeting with a number of folks already about possible collections that they have that they can donate to us. And then as you donate to MiCA, we, Moska and her team, begin to describe the items. Then we digitize what we can, we hold in analog format what we must, and we preserve it for the future for both use in the library, but also through curations on digital platforms. We're delighted that Aisha Kinturk is here also, if I recall correctly. She's coming out of Manal and Newfoundland and Labrador, also part of the big project there with Jennifer Selby. So we're really delighted that this has generated the kind of interest that we're hoping can contribute to a nationwide project. At the moment, MiCA itself, housed here at U of T, is focusing on Ontario, and our hope is to scale up and outward to cover all of Canada. That of course requires amazing human resources, like of the kinds that Moska represents. It also promises the idea of having collections that you as community members, as artists, as budding historians, can draw upon for writing or developing your artistic piece. And of course, it will require financial contributions to ensure that MiCA remains a permanent fixture of the Canadian landscape. And so we're not here at this point to hit you for that. We are looking to talk to you about your stories. We're here to talk to you about your records. We want to talk to you about all of that. We have an infrastructure physically to take it, to receive it, to process it, and to preserve it. We've put it in place in cooperation with the University of Toronto Libraries. We're also consulting and in close partnership with Library Archives Canada, Archives Ontario, and all of these major national and provincial archival collections are working with us to ensure that MiCA serves you, the community, and the larger Canadian public, effectively to Canadianize a story that has oftentimes sat in the margins in your basements and elsewhere. So we're really excited to really launch this, to have you as part of our launch.